Hey everyone, Rob Case here with the Dropping In Surf Show. This is a podcast about bringing math and science in the world of surfing. I am a paddling technique coach located in Northern California, and I apologize, it's been a while since we did the last episode, but been super busy, been traveling a bunch, doing workshops and working with one-on-one clients, and I've been researching and reading a lot about what we're going to go over today. And today, we're going to talk about the relationship of hand speed with the velocity of, in this case, a swimmer, but we're going to tie it into paddling as well. And the reason that we're investigating this now, it really came to the forefront of my mind because I've been responding to a few inquiries from a few of the Olympians. We have from different countries competing this summer in Paris. And some of them are competing at a location that they don't surf often, which is in Tahiti. And they were wondering, like many of kind of the pro clients that come to me, I think the first thing that they think of is wave catching. And they think, well, how can I get better at wave catching from a paddling point of view? And that's where I start with a lot of the pros, even though we end up going back to level one type concepts, because level one type concepts are the things that build the foundation for an effective stroke. And so what I'm going to go over today really focuses on level two, which is wave catching. I also cover pop-up and getting out strategies, but the wave catching, not the timing and the positioning, but really focused on the sprint technique and the three-stroke burst. So if you've been watching the blog, recently I just released one talking about the case for the three-stroke burst, and that's what I teach. Up to waves, probably about 12 foot. Most surfers, almost all surfers, only need a three-stroke burst. Now, it's important that those three strokes that the surfer conducts is at the right time, it's at the correct timing or correct moment, and that all three strokes need to happen within a second and a half. Okay, so that they're quick strokes, the stroke rate is high. But the last critical requirement of the three-stroke burst is that those strokes, every single one of them, need to be effective. And so what is an effective stroke? Well, an effective stroke is one that maximizes I'm going to throw out a bunch of different terminology in today's episode, but an effective stroke maximizes drag propulsion and lift propulsion. And I've talked about this on the podcast before in the past. I've talked about it in the blog. If you're a part of the online program, I've talked a lot about it in the member live streams. But drag force propulsion and lift force propulsion are combined to create an effective stroke. What this specific study that I'm going to go through today, it was from a graduate school of comprehensive human science in Tsukuba, Japan. Oh, I'm going to mess that one up. It's in Japan, led by Koga. I hope that is how we pronounce his name, or her name. Him. I think it's a him. Daiki Koga. But regardless of gender, this team did a fantastic. They've been doing a lot of great research in the world of swimming, and of course, a lot of the research out there is swimming. I am going to relate this to paddling by the end of this. At any rate, this team and these researchers have really produced quite a few recent articles on propulsion. This one in particular stood out to me recently. It's from 2022, so it's the most recent one that I've read from their group. They've been producing a few different ones from 2017 on to 2022 that lead into this. But this one, it's called Relationship Between Hand Kinematics, Hand Hydrodynamic Pressure Distribution, and Hand Propulsive Force in Sprint Front Crawl Swimming. So a couple of things. Let me translate what that all means. First of all, the study focuses on sprinting. And so one of the things that I will very clearly throughout this podcast episode remind you of is that our sprint, when we use it in our surf session, really only comes at the 3-stroke burst when catching a wave, or at most 4 strokes to get out of the way of somebody. It's a way to accelerate quickly. And I tell a lot of my students, I say, hey, listen, if you are taking more than 4 sprint strokes or power strokes at any given time, you need to go back to your efficiency stroke in between. So, for example, if I'm paddling around, I'm using 98% of my strokes, 99% of my strokes are my efficiency technique, which is different than what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the propulsion dynamics are going to be similar, but even those are going to be slightly different because of certain metrics like hand speed will be different. Attack angle will be different. There will be certain metrics that will be different from your power stroke than from your efficiency stroke. So if you know what I'm talking about, you've taken my level 1 course in person, for sure you should know a little bit about what I'm talking about here. And if you haven't, no problem. I've got some resources online in the blog. You can sign up for the free email series to get a quick introduction to paddling technique. But really the best way is to work with me in person, and you'll really get the deep dive into what I'm talking about here. So I'll constantly try to bring up these definitions so that you know what I'm talking about. But if we set the parameters of our discussion today, it's going to be focused on the 3-stroke burst. It's going to be focused on our sprint, because this study was conducted with 24 male swimmers, and these swimmers were asked to do a couple different trials: 3 20-meter front crawl, which is freestyle, not breathing, with maximal effort. That's important. Maximum effort they were asked to do. There were 6 small pressure sensors attached to each hand, both on the palm side of the hand, which it's as described. It's on the palm side of the hand. And I'll show you, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll show you the picture of it. And then 3 sensors. So there are 3 sensors on the palm, and there were 3 sensors on the dorsum or dorsal side of the hand, which is the back side of the palm, or the backhand, backhand. So that's how they measured the pressures, the hydrodynamic pressure distribution in the hands. And they also have 15 motion capture cameras placed in the water to obtain the actual coordinates of the hand. So actually, I'll just show people looking. This is kind of what it looks like. Swimmers swimming along. They were attached to a cord. Their hand sensors, they had 1, 2, 3 on the palm side, and 1, 2, 3 on the dorsal side, or dorsum side. And they describe a few different things, and I'll get into that. And then they have these motion capture cameras. So the data that they pulled and the data that they analyzed only covered the time in which it crossed this 5-meter mark and went to about the 25-meter mark. So they asked them to start from a dead stop, but at the so the wall didn't have an influence. But what they actually captured and measured was when they were at full speed, and these 15 motion capture cameras, which was pretty cool, pretty advanced. So a little bit about the participants. These are high-level swimmers. That's another thing we should definitely note. Let's see here. Results conclusion. Where are the people here? 24 male. Okay, there it is. Their levels range from regional to national finals. And this table right here will show you a little bit about, how tall they were. They averaged, let me pull this up. They averaged about 5'9" in height. about 160 pounds. A bunch of different disciplines were their specialty. Their fastest 50 meter is a 22.61, and I'll tell you that right now, that is very fast. And their slowest member was 24.24, which is still quite fast. Their FINA point, if you're at 1,000 on the FINA point schedule, you're world class. So their average was about 648, so well above average, but not quite world class, but very, very good swimmers and quite young, in general. So that's kind of the group that they measured. And I'm going to kind of set the stage here. This was the main goal here was, it was aimed to determine the interrelationships between the hand kinematic variables, the pressures, the hydrodynamic pressures around the hand, and fluid forces exerted by swimmers when at maximum effort. So what should swimmers keep in mind to swim faster, essentially? Now, that is what the goal was. For surfers, that might not be our goal. Our goal, as I've specified in other articles, is really acceleration is more important than top speed. But this goes hand in hand with acceleration. I talked about it, I think, in the last podcast about acceleration and how important that is. This is a step towards, well, how do we get that acceleration? What is an effective propulsive stroke? And like I said, it's drag propulsion and lift propulsion. But what does that mean? What do we need to do? And so we're going to get into that a little bit. We go into the setup and what things are defined here, data acquisition. We're going to skip all this because it really has no bearing unless you really, really want to know. But it really has no bearing on our discussion today. So I'll skip all this. This is how it looks. One thing that you'll need to know from this visual, is that there's a difference how they define pressure, force, and propulsion. Propulsive force. So let's start with hand pressure. So hand pressure force is defined essentially as the difference between the palm side and the dorsal side. So the palm minus the dorsal pressure times the size of the hand area. So that's hand pressure force. And so propulsive force is actually the same exact thing, but it's in the direction that provides them with propulsion forward. So pressure force and propulsive force are similar. Like, for example, for your own, you can think of it as when I enter my hand, I start to feel pressure of the water. Well, that's pressure force. But the force that actually sends me forward, propulsive force, is going to be when I actually orient my hand or my arm more vertically and I start beginning to push backwards, for example. That's propulsive force. So that's a main definition that we need to understand, is that they're very similar. They're very close. Hand pressure force refers to the hydrodynamic force acting to the plane of the hands, the perpendicular to the plane of the hands. So that's just any force that you feel, essentially. And propulsive force is how much of that hand pressure force is used to propel the hand or propel the body. So that's pretty much all we need to know there in terms of definitions that are a bit confusing. I'm going to move on to the next page. This is the description of all those things that we just went over. This is just interesting background data. It's more definitions of what propulsion is, so we're going to skip that. And we're going to go right to kind of the results and the discussion, because this is really what we're going after. Now, very, very important here. We're going to talk about correlation and the correlation coefficient. So it's measured off the Pearson correlation coefficient, and that's what they use to test the relationship between each variable. So the Pearson correlation coefficient goes from -1 to 1. 0 means there's no correlation at all. So from 0 to 1, I'm going to start with the positive numbers. So from 0 to 1, a 1 means that there's a it's actually completely 100% correlated is a 1. So here they're talking about the coefficient of correlation. The coefficient is if it's less than 0.3, so 30% or less, but that's stopping at 0. So 0 to 0.3 is what they're not telling us here. So 0 to 0.3, it's low correlation. 0.3 to 0.5 is moderate correlation. 0.5 to 0.7 is high. 0.7 and 0.9 is very high. And anything higher than 0.9 to 1 is extremely high correlation. Now, what they don't explain here that is explained elsewhere is that the same thing happens when the number is a negative. So if it is a negative, then the correlation is inversely correlated. So correlation means that you have one variable, you have variable A and you have variable B. So as variable A goes up, if the correlation is at 1, then variable B goes up the same amount, right? But a negative 1 means that if variable A goes up, variable B goes down. It's inversely correlated, but they're still very correlated when they get closer to the 1 value, the negative 1 value. It's just that the magnitude is opposite of the other one. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense because that's going to be important when we get into some of this data. They also do this thing called effect size, but we're not going to talk about effect size all that much. So it goes over the goal again, and now we're going to get into some of the results. Okay, now, the first thing that they talk about here is that swimming velocity was significantly positively correlated with 3 other variables. One is hand speed. So what is hand speed? Hand speed is how fast your hand is moving back or moving through the stroke underwater. Okay, so that's hand speed. How fast is your hand moving through the water underwater? That is not the same as stroke rate, or in this, they call it stroke frequency. Okay, so really interesting distinction there. Hand speed. Okay, so I'll reiterate. Swimming velocity, so how fast they're moving, was significantly positively correlated with the hand speed, a correlation of 0.881. So if you remember, the closer to 1, the better. So the more correlated, I should say, not the better, but the more correlated, positively correlated. Meaning, the faster the hand speed, the faster the swimmer. The faster the swimmer, the faster the hand speed. That's the correlation. It's pretty correlated. 0.881 is quite high. Now, swim speed is also highly positively correlated to propulsive force. Duh. I think that one's propulsive force. Okay, so propulsive force was correlated 0.751. So also quite high, but not as high as hand speed. And then the last one that had really high correlation with swimmer's velocity was pressure force. So if we remember, pressure force, hand pressure force, is the palm minus the dorsal times the size of the hand. Okay, so what is the difference between hand pressure force and propulsive force? Hand pressure force is the difference between palm and dorsal side times the size of the hand, regardless of where the hand is in the stroke. But propulsive force is hand pressure force that is how much of the hand pressure force is used to propel the hand. So in the propulsive direction. Okay, so you got two things that are really close to each other in definition: propulsive force and pressure force. But hand speed is different. Okay, hand speed is something that I want to bring to your attention because you may think stroke rate, which is stroke frequency, which is how fast you're moving your arms and you're moving your hands through the cycle, is that definition. But hand speed is different. you can actually have a relatively lower stroke rate with a high hand speed. Because what happens underwater, that's the important part. Now, I have talked in the past about slipping. Okay, slipping is when you overpower the water, and it's different than hand speed. So one would think, well, if you slip and your hand pushes through that pressure differential, which we're going to talk about today, then your hand speed will go up. But that's not what we're talking about here. This is under the parameters that your hand is not slipping. Hand speed is going faster, but you are still holding that pressure. That's very, very important. That makes an effective stroke. Okay. So, in other words, I'll summarize this first one. The faster the hand moves in the water, the greater the hydrodynamic force exerted by the hand is, and the faster the swimmer goes. That's it. The greater the propulsive force acting in the propulsive direction, the greater the velocity of the swimmer. That one's pretty straightforward, right? Now, they actually covered that in a past study, that principle that the greater the propulsive force acting in the propulsive direction, the greater the velocity. But in that other study, they did talk about this thing called quasi-steady theory, suggesting that it doesn't quite hold because the flow field around the hand is unsteady, meaning the water molecules going around, the flow around the arm and the hand are unsteady. So, there's kind of a caveat there. So really what they're saying here is they're saying there's a little asterisk slightly around the blanket straightforward mechanism that greater propulsive force acting in the propulsive direction leads to faster velocity. So they kind of summarize it here that, based on the results of this study, we'll discuss the mechanism of improving propulsion and swimming velocity, and regardless of this flow field around the hand being unsteady. So we're basically going to assume that the flow state around the hand is steady. Let me summarize why I'm bringing this up. This is exactly what I was just talking about with slipping. Okay, so when there is slipping, when there is unsteady flow field around the hand, then the hand speed and the propulsive force is different. Okay, so this is just saying that, hey, we're assuming that the flow state around the hand is more steady and we don't need to deal with it, period. Okay, the next kind of discussion point that they bring up. Pressure force calculated by multiplying the difference between the pressures on the palm and the dorsum times the hand's area. We've already discussed that. Now, here's really interesting. The greater the pressure difference, the greater the pressure force exerted. Okay, so I'll back that up. So if the hand pressure force is defined as the palm minus the dorsal side, so the pressure on the palm minus the pressure on the dorsal times the hand. Let's assume that the hand size is constant. That's the same. Let's say it's one swimmer, the hand side's constant, right? So therefore, hand pressure force will only go up if the palm pressure and the dorsal pressure are far apart. The difference is very high. Okay, we've talked about this with lift propulsion, folks. That's part of the definition of lift propulsion. So let's get down here, okay? So the greater the pressure difference, the greater the pressure force exerted. Now, in this study, they actually considered the palm and the dorsal side separately, whereas in past studies that has not been the case. So this is why I really got excited about this. Let's get to the next kind of key takeaway here. The pressure on the dorsal side, the back side of the arm, remember that's the side that's trailing as we push backwards, showed a very high negative correlation with hand speed, the propulsive force and velocity. Okay, hold on a second. So I'm going to repeat this. The back side of the hand's pressure showed a very high negative correlation with hand speed. So there's that negative. So what does that mean? Let's start with that one. So what this means that the lower the pressure on the dorsal side of the hand is, the higher the hand speed is. And vice versa. The higher the hand speed, the lower the dorsal pressure on the back side of the arm. Should make sense. Should make sense because as the hand is moving through that space of water, the water that needs to fill in that space needs to go faster in order to fill in that space. And so for a moment in time, the pressure is a lot lower. If you move your hand really slowly, that water has plenty of time to fill in that space that where your hand used to be. And so the pressure is higher on the dorsal side of the arm. So that should make sense. But that's where the negative correlation comes into play. So the lower the pressure dorsal, the higher the hand speed, and vice versa. Okay. Now, it also showed that the lower, because it's a high negative correlation, so this was R of negative 0.72 between the dorsal pressure and hand speed. Also, dorsal side compared to propulsive force, negative 0.656. So also significant, I would say high negative correlation, not very high, but high negative correlation, meaning the higher the propulsive force, which is the direction that your hand's going in and the force acting on it, on the really kind of the overall propulsive force. I'm not going to say the palm side, but that's kind of what you would feel or how you would relate that. So that propulsive force, the higher that is, the lower the pressure on the dorsal side. Now that should make sense because what we're talking about here is lift propulsion, and it's the difference between the palm and the dorsal side of the arm, and it creates vortices. We're going to get to that in a second. That's a nice little teaser into this next paragraph. But the last thing it says is that the lower the pressure of the dorsal side of the hand, the higher the swimming velocity. Woohoo, very interesting. All right, so it's a correlation of negative 0.676. Again, I would say high negative correlation, not very high negative correlation, but high. So in other words, as the hand speed increases, the pressure on the dorsal side decreases and the propulsive forces increase, which led to an increase in swimming velocity. Okay, so, this is very exciting. Okay. On the other hand, you're probably thinking, well, what about the palm? What about the palm pressure, Rob? Well, the palm pressure was not correlated with the hand speed, but it did show a positive correlation with propulsive force, but not super high. It was only a 0.5 with propulsive force, and that was shocking. So one, the palm pressure, no correlation with hand speed, and I'll tell you what. Let's see here, hand speed here. What are we talking about? We're saying palm. Okay, so palm here and hand speed. Where are you? Hand speed right there. Mean hand speed a 0.32. So that's very low correlation. And that's a shocker. But you look right next to it, dorsal is 0.72 correlation to hand speed. Okay, so that's what that's saying. But it is saying that the palm pressure is correlated positively with propulsive force, which would make sense, and angle of attack. And even the angle of attack, I would say it's barely correlated. It's a 0.471. Now, we're going to get into more specific example here in a minute. We'll just put that one aside. But essentially, what was super interesting about this, and they pointed out here, is that the pressure of the dorsal side in absolute value terms was twice as large as the pressure on the palm. Wow. Okay. Hold on. Let's take a moment to think about this. So the hydrodynamic pressure on the palm is more than half of the hydrodynamic pressure on the back side of the hand. That's incredible, because a lot of people think the harder I push in my stroke, the faster I'll go. There's some truth to that, but what's more important is the backside of the hand. It has more to do with lowering the pressure on the backside of the hand than adding more pressure on the palm. That's a huge takeaway. Should blow people's minds, okay? Because that is not how surfers think. Okay. Now I know this is quite confusing, but there's one more point I want to really pull out of this. Well, maybe it's one more. Is it one more? Let me just double check my notes. Nope. It's going to be a couple more points. But this next one is extremely fun for me because it talks about lift propulsion. Okay. So it says integrating the above results assumes that the swimmer with high hand speed generates a strong vortex on the dorsum side of the hand, which reduces the pressure on the dorsal side of the hand, resulting in negative pressure, and the absolute value of which is considerably greater than the palm. Okay, what the heck did that just mean? That is lift propulsion in a perfect definition. And this is the hardest thing to teach people. Drag propulsion has to do with arm orientation and surface area. That's for every action, there's equal and opposite. If I want to move forward, I got to push backwards. That's drag propulsion. And most surfers are getting about half of their stroke is mostly drag propulsion. I would say more than half of their stroke is, I would say, okay, let me put this way. Most of their stroke is drag propulsion. Only the surfers that have been in the water the most really tap into lift propulsion. And it's a vortex that forms from the palm side to the dorsal side of the hand and then the arm. Why? Because once again, as your hand moves backwards through the stroke, there's space behind the hand where it used to be that the water needs to fill in. Now, the faster that hand moves, the hand speed, the greater that pressure differential and the greater the vortex is, the greater the strength of the vortex. And when the vortex is very strong, you can push harder against it and move faster without slipping. Now, what is slipping? The slipping is you're not allowing that vortex to even form. You're overpowering the pressure differential and you're overpowering water. So that's like, again, spinning tires on your car and not going anywhere. You use a ton of fuel, but there's no friction. You're not going anywhere, right? This only is taking into account when you're going fast. Lift propulsion mostly happens when you're at higher speeds and your arms are really, your hand speed is going very fast. Therefore, this. The significant difference or the significant decrease in the dorsal side of pressure increases the hydrodynamic pressure difference between the palm and the dorsum of the hand. So if you want to create, here's what this is saying. It says here, it is the main contributor to the increase in hydrodynamic force. Now, let me tell you what this means. Rob, how do I get more lift propulsion? You don't push harder. Right? The palm pressure doesn't do it. It's making your hand move faster in the water, but also holding pressure. It's a tight balance, okay? You can't just move your hand really quickly through water and not grab anything and not feel pressure on your palm. That's not what we're talking about here. That's extremely important because propulsive force also needs to be there. But what this visual should show you, which is the dorsal side being more than twice the amount of pressure than the palm side, is that it has way less to do with how much pressure is on your palm and way more to do with negative pressure on the dorsal side. That's the huge part. That's the most important thing. It's the negative pressure on the dorsal side. Okay? And that's extremely important. All right. So, in summary, they actually talk about it here. The acceleration of water on the dorsum side of the hand, rather than pushing water on the palm of the hand, makes the biggest difference. So that's another way of saying it. Very exciting. Okay, so this next page here, it's basically the correlation of each variable, and I've kind of already popped into that. There's a couple interesting things here that I think, some people, here's a good example: stroke frequency versus stroke length, right? So this is what we talk about where, what is stroke length? Stroke length is how far you go with each stroke. And stroke frequency is stroke rate, which is how quickly you turn over your arms. And so this makes sense that it's highly negatively correlated. It's a negative 0.78 because there's a fine line between stroke rate and stroke length. And I talk a lot about that in our courses. How do I go faster? Do I increase one or the other? Well, there's a balance between the two. Now, in level 1, I talk about reducing your stroke frequency to get a higher quality stroke first, meaning increasing your stroke length. So if I reduce my stroke frequency, I'm going to, just as a byproduct, get a longer stroke, go further with each stroke. But that's when we refine our technique to be as perfect as possible. Once you get it as perfect as possible in terms of the motion and the movement of your arm, then it's really easy to increase your speed again. You just reintroduce stroke rate to it, and you end up going faster. It's that simple. So there's one that I think is just kind of just an interesting thing to discuss. You could see that another kind of interesting one was the stroke frequency to the palm. Let's say stroke frequency to hand speed. We talked about this. So there's really no correlation. There's barely any correlation between your hand speed and your stroke rate. So that is another thing to really cement into your brains. Increasing your hand speed doesn't necessarily mean increasing your stroke rate. So there is a difference here. Here, this study is talking specifically about an effective propulsive stroke. So a singular stroke. How do we make the swimmer go faster with a singular stroke? Well, it has nothing to do with stroke frequency because that would be one stroke. Now, that being said, you will also hear me in level 2 talk about stroke rate, and like I kicked off this podcast, you do need to get 3 strokes in a second and a half at the right time of the wave catching sequence in order to make it as easy as possible. And those 3 strokes need to be effective. They need to be effective, meaning the hand speed needs to be high and the propulsive force needs to be high. And boom, that's where we're going to get high swimming velocity and acceleration. Anyway, this is a fun chart. I'm going to go ahead and move on. The items in gray, by the way, if you are watching this, the items in gray are just statistically significant. That's all this is showing. And this is the big point. The pressure of the dorsal side of the hand is highly negatively correlated to the hand speed. Very, very important. So moving down, this top visual is really interesting because it kind of shows you all those different, it's more of a visual representation of the relationships of every different variable. So here's hand speed, right here, hand speed and swimming velocity, highly correlated, 0.881. Hand speed to the pressure of the dorsal, highly negatively correlated, so 0.72, but a negative. So those are quite high. Hand speed to propulsive force, 0.8. So very highly correlated, 0.87. Velocity and propulsive force, highly correlated. Hand speed and hand pressure force, somewhat correlated on the high end, 0.6. The dorsal side negatively correlated to propulsive force. And that's all this is showing is like you have high pressure on the palm side, you have negative pressure on this side, you get vortices that form around your hand the high pressure likes to fill in this low pressure. So it's moving back there, right? And that's the correlation, okay? Now, to go back to our summary, a reduction in the dorsal pressure is more critical than an increase in the palm pressure. But it doesn't mean that the palm pressure is not involved in the increase in propulsive force. It is. It is extremely important. That means that you can't just put your arm in the water and rip it through as fast as you can to get high hand speed. If you're ripping it through and you're slipping and you're not getting propulsive force and you're not getting palm pressure, then you're not going to go anywhere. That's slipping. That's another definition of slipping. When you don't allow it time to create this differential between the palm side and the dorsal side of the hand. Very important. But it's just suggesting that the dorsal side is more important for faster swimmers. Okay, so this study, here's another important point. This study reported that as stroke frequency was increased, the swimming velocity also increased. But the palm pressure did not increase significantly, whereas the dorsal pressure decreased significantly and the hydrodynamic pressure differences increased. So that's really, really important. It didn't have to do with stroke frequency. It had to do the quality of the effectiveness of the propulsion. That's what this is saying. So that right there isolates somebody that's saying, oh, well, you're going faster because you're turning your arms over. You're getting more propulsion because you're turning your arms over faster, or you're going faster because you're turning your arms over faster. There's another study that does say that, and there is some truth to that, but this is diving into the weeds even more. But why are we going faster? It has more to do with the pressure on the dorsal side of the hand. I think I'm beating that to a bloody pulp. Now, the next section, this is where we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to show you an example. We're going to show you an example of the fastest swimmer in the group versus the slowest swimmer in the group. Okay? I love this. So we're going to say swimmer A is the fastest, swimmer X is the slowest average speed or velocity. So we're gonna take a look actually visually. So if you aren't, I'll try to describe this. But what we're looking at here on the very top, on the left column, this is swimmer A, the fastest. On the right column is swimmer X, the slowest swimmer. So I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so we can see this. Okay. So this first one on top is showing the force pressure of the hand propulsive and the hand pressure. So hand propulsive is in yellow, and black is the hand pressure force. So the stroke goes in, and it's the hand pressure feels a little bit because the water is pressing against it, but there's no propulsive force because they haven't dropped the hand into the catch phase or to the front propulsive phase. So as they drop down, they start to build up pressure. And you're getting hand pressure force and you're getting hand propulsive force, but they're slightly different because of the arm orientation. Then this swimmer on the left-hand side and the swimmer on the right-hand side, they both have kind of a sculling. It appears that they have kind of a sculling drop down into the propulsive phase of the stroke. So this is not what I teach. What I teach is you're going to have pressure all the way through to the back propulsive phase and then drop off. But there's this kind of change in pressure here in the middle of their stroke. And then at the tail end of this really good swimmer stroke, the hand propulsive force and the hand pressure forces are the same, and they build up quite high to over 100, up to 140 newtons, which is incredibly high for an average, and then it gets released. Then the stroke gets released. In comparison to the not as good swimmer, same kind of entry. They enter flat. They're going to feel some pressure, but no propulsive forces. They build up. They do their little skull into their propulsive part of the stroke. They don't get nearly as high of force. They're only maxing out about 60 pounds of force or 60 newtons of force, newtons of force. And what's also interesting to note is the length of time it takes them. So the faster swimmers is finishing this stroke at about 0.6 seconds. It's starting to release, and it takes the slower swimmer about 0.8 seconds. So a 0.2 second difference in just stroke time or hand speed. Wow, look at that. Now that is not how they define hand speed here. So I'm going to actually take that comment back a little bit. Just think stroke rate. Okay, it's a faster stroke rate in general, but that has less to do with the ultimate speed. Now, but from a surfing point of view, having the better swimmer's timing of the stroke rate is going to allow you to get the 3 strokes in a second and a half, the 3-stroke burst in a second and a half, and that is critical. So that's very, very important. Now, moving down to the next graph down below it is the pressure differential between the palm and the dorsal side. So the palm is in red and the dorsal side is in blue. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but what you can see very clearly between the good swimmer and the not so fast swimmer, the fast swimmer and the not so fast swimmer, is look at the differences between the palm and the dorsal. The red, the palm side are relatively the same in terms of pressure, right? Kilopascals. So they're about the same. The timing of it is different, but in terms of like their maximums are about the same. But look at the difference of the dorsal. There's a much, much more negative pressure on the dorsal side in the faster swimmer. Significantly less. So there is the difference. That is exactly what we've been talking about. It has nothing to do, it has a lot less to do with the palm pressure and has a heck of a lot more to do with the pressure, negative pressure on the dorsal side of the hand and arm. Wow. Now, if that's not evidence alone, we also have hand speed down here. And if you look at the hand speed, if we took the average hand speed of the faster swimmer, you can see near the tail end of their stroke, their hand speed increases significantly, much, much faster. I think, during the mid part of the stroke, it's about the same. It's a little bit faster than the slower swimmer in terms of magnitude, but at the tail end of the good swimmer, the faster swimmer's stroke, that hand speed just skyrockets up to 5 meters per second in the hand speed, or close to 5. That's incredible. Whereas the slower swimmer only gets just above 3 meters per second with their hand speed, not their velocity, but their hand speed. Now that's very interesting, because that is just another visual representation of what we've already been talking about, how the pressure differential and hand speed are more directly correlated, and hand propulsive force. And as a result, this swimmer on the left, swimmer A, is significantly faster than swimmer X on the right. Done. Crazy. So, the big question. The big question here is, how can swimmers increase the speed of their hands? I think we've beaten it to a bloody pulp that we need to increase our hand speed if we want to go faster, right? So how can we do that? That's the key. And that's for surfers as well. How can we increase the speed of our hands, right? So there are some interesting things that are said here. If a swimmer blindly increases the number of strokes to increase hand speed, meaning if you as a surfer blindly increase your stroke rate in order to increase hand speed, the time and distance that the hand moves in the water will be shortened, and the hand will leave the water without increasing hand speed sufficiently. You're just going to blow right through the stroke without getting any pressure developed. Stroke length was also correlated with swimming velocity by quite a bit. So stroke length, meaning what I typically will describe stroke length as, is quality of stroke. Right? So if stroke length was also correlated, and I would say it's moderately correlated, it's a 0.5 with swimming velocity. So in other words, if the swimmer swam faster, the distance traveled in one stroke would be longer, but stroke length is only a result. And a longer stroke length did not imply a faster swim speed. Instead, it should be understood that the distance traveled per stroke was longer due to moving the hand as fast and as long as possible in the water. It still comes back to hand speed. Right? So you can actually have a relatively low stroke rate, a high stroke length, and have a high stroke hand speed. So when we look at we're just looking at sprint stroke right now, but if we were to associate this to our efficiency stroke, could we also potentially say that hand speed is important? Absolutely. It's going to work a little bit differently, but that's why another reason why I may be able to travel further with a lot less effort with a very low stroke rate. My efficiency strokes, my gears 1, 2, and 3, my gear 3 is quite fast in terms of how fast I move through the water. But my stroke rate is rather slow compared to my power strokes, where my stroke rate is high. So how do I change that? It's not so much about pushing harder, though there is a little bit of an element to that kinesthetically. But from a physics point of view, it's that my hand speed is a little bit faster, right? So again, how can swimmers or surfers increase the speed of our hands? And they go into, well, we can't draw any conclusions based on the results of this study alone, but some inferences that would need to be considered when we're talking about hand speed is a combination of left and right upper limbs, rolling movements. Ooh, I'm going to talk about that. And then the last one they say is coordination of upper limb stroking movements with lower limb kicking movements, which I will go ahead and kibosh right now because there's a little bit of that for our sprint. But if we look at my level 1 checklist, step 8 is kick and body. All right, step 8 is the very last step to increasing propulsive force and really refining your stroke. There are 7 previous steps to this before you should even think about step 8. There are things that will increase your hand speed, but step 8 is the one that they're talking about here with the rolling movements. So step 8 and the timing of your roll and your body actually does increase your hand speed and the way in which you do that. Now, I'm going to tell you that as a kind of a little tip right now, but I don't want you to ever try this because without the first 7 steps in this level 1 checklist, you're going to do it wrong. I guarantee it. So if you think about rolling faster and that's going to increase your hand speed, which it does, the technicality of it is that as you get to the propulsive phase of the stroke, if you were to roll at the right moment of the stroke with your hand is going to move through the water quicker without you actually having to apply more force, just through the rolling timing of the rolling. Now that is assuming you have great lateral balance control, which is step 2. So oftentimes in level 2, we go back to step 2 when we work on step 2 in order to increase step 8, which is then increases your hand speed. All right. So how do we, it's crazy. How do we walk away from this, right? In terms of surfing, like what's kind of our conclusion? Well, there's a lot of conclusions in general here. But for us, I want you to take away the main thing here that hand speed and blindly increasing the number of strokes does not correlate. So stroke rate does not correlate with hand speed. Yes, you need to figure out how to move your hand faster underwater, while at the same time still having strong propulsive hand force in the correct direction. And if you do that, you'll get very, very high drag propulsion and lift propulsion, because the pressure differential between the palm and the dorsal side will be greater. And that right here in this part of the stroke at the end of the fast swimmer stroke, where he's getting the most hand propulsive force and the difference is the greatest between the palm and the dorsal pressure, this swimmer is getting both drag propulsion, optimal drag propulsion, because their arm is vertical and they're pushing backwards. And you can see that how it's correlated with the hand pressure force. It's almost 1-to-1 perfect ratio. But the thing that really takes them to that next level, and that's what we're talking about here. This swimmer on the right is a very, very fast swimmer. 24 seconds for a 50 meter. That is incredibly fast. This guy's no slouch. But the guy on the left is that much better because of this one part. Meaning their pressure differential, their hand speed is much higher. And this pressure difference, so they are getting both drag propulsion and lift propulsion optimally. So a lot of people that take my level 1 course, they're very confused by lift propulsion. It confuses their brain. And I understand. It's crazy because you can't really see it unless you're doing it wrong. You can't really feel it unless you start doing the drills I teach, right? But this is the evidence behind it. This is the science behind why I teach that. Why it's so critical for you to practice lift propulsion as well as drag propulsion, because the faster the swimmer. I mean, we look at their times. We'll kind of end with this. What's here? Where are we? There we go. We're going to go back up to this chart right here that's showing swimmer A versus swimmer X. Swimmer A's 50-meter swim is 22.61 seconds. Swimmer X's 50-meter swim is 26.24. Actually, that's pretty close to my personal best. So that's a huge difference. 22.61 versus 26.24 for the 50-meter. Woohoo! I'm telling you that's like the difference between first place and, 50th place in the 50-meter or even more. Now, for surfers, it doesn't matter as much. But when we get back to the whole reason I wanted to do this podcast, which had to do with getting into the waves in Tahiti, there's a couple very, very important parts of it. One is stroke rate. You need to get 3 strokes in a second and a half. So your stroke rate needs to be high. Your stroke force needs to be higher, meaning your propulsive force, and your drag force propulsion needs to be optimal, meaning just like swimmer A. But also, you need to have high lift propulsion, which is the difference between the palm and the dorsal. So all of those things are critical in making the drop in Tahiti, or really any critical wave. That's where paddling could make the difference. It could give you an extra fraction of a second of time to get to your feet and navigate down a steep section. Now, I have told you on other podcasts that paddling doesn't catch a wave, and it does not get you to the speeds of catching a wave. And we've talked about that. But what paddling does is it helps you get into those other forces that get you up to the speed of the wave faster. So instead of the gravity setting in so drastically, you have a little bit more time, just a little bit. And at critical waves, like in Tahiti, Pipeline, it could be fractions of a second. But at most normal breaks, it could be up to a second, maybe even more, depending on the type of board you're riding. So very, very important for you to practice this, try it, work on it. Think about how do you increase hand speed and propulsive force at the same time. And if you really, really want to learn it, come on out to a level 1 course. If you've already taken level 1, level 2 takes it even further. We look at your actual pressure on your hands. We measure it. We show you where you're slipping. We show you where you're inefficient. And we work on drills that deepen that level 1 understanding and get your brain to do it all automatically, because none of you guys should be thinking about your paddling strokes as you're paddling into a wave, especially a wave in Tahiti. So I hope this was educational, somewhat entertaining, and I appreciate the 5 of you guys listening and watching. Until next time, I'll see you in the water.